Welcome back, and thank you for joining us for Two Steps Toward our daily Bible study. I am James, and this is Aid, and we are up to episode 159 of the book of Judges, episode 159 of our study, chapter 6 of Judges. And Aid, I know Judges was one that you were lamenting a little bit that we were going to be studying next, and I think it was due to, I don't know, maybe lack of familiarity kind of thing. But I'm hoping that you are enjoying some of the narratives. The thing I like about Judges...
I think it's great.
You do think it's great. That sounded a little disingenuous, but the fact that every chapter has like its own judge and its own narrative account, and it's like, for me works. Like it's really systematic and...
There's only 20 chapters.
Yeah, it's not that long. And each section is its own like distinct section. So we're getting into Gideon here in Judges chapter 6, and this is going to go chapters 6 through 8. But again, they're like individually contained stories that are easy to sort of wrap your head around. So here we go with chapter 6. Make sure to read through your copy at home. And here is my personal paraphrase as we enter into the narrative of Gideon. The Israelites again did evil, and God gave them into the hands of the Midianites for 7 years. The Midianites, as well as a group of a couple other eastern people, would always come and pillage and ruin the Israelites' crops during harvest time. The Israelites cried out to God for help, and God sent them a prophet, a nameless prophet, who reminded the Israelites of their history dating back to Egypt and how Israel has not listened to God, falling into the worship of the false gods. The angel of the Lord then appeared to a man named Gideon, who was threshing wheat in a winepress, and said, "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon respectfully asked how, if the Lord was with them, all this terrible stuff was happening in their lives. And the Lord told Gideon to go and save Israel. So he was going to be the next judge. Gideon complained that his clan was the weakest in Manasseh, in the tribe of Manasseh, and that he himself was the least in his own family.
Does that mean the youngest?
There's some debate as to what exactly it means. It could be the youngest, it could be the least accomplished, it could be the least talented in some way. But he's like, Gideon's the least of the least of the least. So he's in other words, the least likely hero for Israel, and yet there's specific reason that God is choosing him then. The Lord replied that he'd be with Gideon and would strike down all the Midianites. Gideon then asked for a sign that the Lord would be with him. Gideon presented an offering, a sacrificial goat, to the Lord, and when he presented the offering, the angel sort of touched the offering with his staff, and the angel disappeared, and a fire flared up and consumed the sacrifice. Gideon realized very clearly this is the sovereign Lord, and Gideon feared that he might die, having seen God now face to face. This is the common reaction of people in the Bible when in the presence of holiness, like an angel or the angel of the Lord, is they are afraid they're going to die because they recognize their own weaknesses. God calmed Gideon down and assured him that he wouldn't die. Gideon built an altar there in this place called Ophrah, and this was called "The Lord is Peace." The altar was called this. God had Gideon tear down his father's altar to Baal and cut down his Asherah pole. Remember, those are the male and female equivalent gods in Canaan. With the wood, he had him build a proper altar to God and offered the second bull from his father's flock on it as a burnt offering. Gideon did all this at night with 10 servants so that the townspeople wouldn't see, because Gideon is a coward and is scared of his townspeople. When they woke up the next morning, they were angry enough to kill Gideon when they saw that the altars were torn down. Joash, Gideon's father, actually defends Gideon at this point, arguing that if Baal really was any sort of god, he could have defended himself against his altars being torn down. So Gideon at this point was given the name Jerub-Baal, which means let Baal contend with him. When the Midianites and other eastern peoples came and camped at the valley of Jezreel, Gideon summoned his people to follow him as the Spirit of the Lord was upon him. Gideon asked for a sign, and this is kind of a famous incident where Gideon puts his fleece on the ground and asks that it be made wet the next morning, but that the rest of the ground have no dew on it, that it be dry. He goes outside and he finds the next morning that that's the case. His fleece is wet, but the ground is dry. He asks for an additional sign one more time, and he says, okay, I'm going to put my fleece on the ground, and I'm going to ask for it to be dry, but that the ground be filled with dew and wet the next day. And it was again the case. So the exact same sign done kind of in reverse this time. And that's the end of Judges chapter 6.
What do you think about these signs?
Yeah, it seems to me like, wow, I don't get to do that today. And Gideon is already acknowledged in multiple ways that he's not a particularly faithful individual, and therefore demanding signs seems like another act of faithlessness. God has already promised to him he doesn't need signs. In fact, in some respects, he's already shown him a sign. He showed him that sign where the angel of the Lord consumed the altar, right? So why does he need more signs? And it's that level of uncertainty, despite God's promises, that makes Gideon this really unattractively faithless individual. Gideon is not portrayed in the Bible. So starting with Gideon and moving forward, we're going to continue to see judges that God is not asking you to emulate. So they're people and instruments that God uses to deliver his people. They're individuals God uses to deliver his people, but not heroes in the sense that we're supposed to act exactly like them. I think the classic example of this is Samson, who, while powerful and famous and heroic, is nonetheless a terrible individual and not somebody that God is trying to get us to pattern ourselves after. I don't know. Did you have a different kind of take on it than that?
No, I didn't think there was any way it was possibly a good thing.
Right. Yeah. Even though it's a little tricky because God supplies it, right? So you'd think if Gideon is like challenging God or testing God, God shouldn't enable that. But it's possible God is just kind of acknowledging. It's kind of like when Moses complains to God and says, "I'm not good at speaking," and God says, "Fine, take Aaron." He gives him like a compromise, even though it's not necessary. All right, so devotional thoughts for today. Number one, I'm going to steal this phrase from Philip Yancey, who's written a number of great Christian books, but is "Where is God when it hurts?" And verse 13, so the angel, this messenger, comes to Gideon and calls him and says, okay, God is going to deliver the Israelites and you're going to lead them and yada, yada. And Gideon essentially asks why is God, if he actually cares about us, why is he allowing all this bad stuff to happen? And if God really cares about us, our life should be easier, is essentially the argument. And the reality is that God is allowing this bad stuff to happen. All this stuff, their oppression, is happening because God cares about them. And in other words, not all bad circumstances are the product of needing chastisement. So Job is a good example. He doesn't need chastisement, but he gets bad circumstances. But that doesn't mean that some bad circumstances aren't discipline, punishment, or chastisement for God's children. And so I think the practical application is whenever you're facing hardship in life, it's worth asking the question of whether or not you have any false gods that you should be repenting of. Because God's chastening, or the fact that God does not give up on us like a loving parent, he seeks to correct us. He doesn't just abandon us. It's evidence of God's love. It's not evidence of the absence of God's love or the absence of God. Hardship, in other words, in our lives. The book of Hebrews is very clear about this. God disciplines us because he loves us, not because he doesn't love us. But the nature of being an immature child is sometimes we interpret loving discipline from parents as, evil. So whereas God, when it hurts, God is actually, he could have just left the Israelites completely, but instead he sort of scolds them and reprimands them and grounds them and chastens them. Devotional thought number 2, why Gideon? So this gets to a little bit what we were asking earlier. He has all these statements about, I'm the weakest of my clan, and my clan is like the weakest in Manasseh, and Manasseh is one of the weaker tribes, and like it's least of the least of the least. And, what Paul says in 1 Corinthians about God choosing the weak and foolish things of the world to shame the wise and strong things in the world, I think that's probably what applies here. God uses unimpressive things, unimpressive people to accomplish his extraordinary purposes so that when the good comes, the one who gets the credit for it is not the talented individual, but the gracious God who provides it in the process. So I think, again, the encouragement here is Gideon's a coward. He's faithless. He doesn't trust God despite his promises. He's the weakest. He's the most frail. He's not particularly intelligent. He's a lowly farmer. Nothing against farmers, but there's nothing like he's not given any kind of military prowess or anything like that. And so I think what it means is no matter what this world thinks of you or you think of yourself, God can accomplish a lot more through you than you would ever deem yourself capable of.
I saw a meme today. I feel like I utter that phrase a lot.
You do.
I saw a meme today and it said, the best advice my dad ever gave me was, you believed in Santa Claus for 8 years, you can believe in yourself for 10 seconds. Like, you just tell yourself that when you have something, when you are not feeling courageous and you, like, have a task that God put in front of you one way or another, that he will, like, see you through it. Just believe in yourself. Because you know that he will give you the strength. Yeah.
It's an interesting balance, believing in yourself versus sober reality, like not overestimating yourself. Like, I think we understand there's pits on both sides of that. But, so in other words, thinking that I can do anything or
you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
That's another cliche that's worth thinking about. But like,
well, we were watching Jeopardy today, and the guy had something like $20,000, the returning champion, and he did a final Jeopardy, and he bets like $5, something really small.
Small amount.
And I was like, why would he do that? And you said, it's very calculated. It's because he can't lose.
He was so far ahead that,
You said, well, why would he bet more? And I'm like, why wouldn't he?
Yeah.
It's money. He could have gotten, and he got it, the answer right, the final Jeopardy. I'm like, he could have had another $20,000. I don't know. Sometimes I think big and
he's not trusting himself enough and
you think realistically, but I think sometimes you limit yourself in your thinking.
Yeah.
You can't play it safe all the time.
No, it's true. And I there has to be confidence is an amazing factor that can make almost anything better. It can also be incredibly dangerous.
I also break a lot of things.
Yes, when you move forward that quickly with that much self-assurance, if it's ungrounded, it actually hurts things and hurts people and hurts yourself, right? But if you don't have any confidence, you'll never actually move forward. And so it's got to be the combination of the two. And for the Christian, where it ends up landing is, okay, yes, I'm undeniably valuable. If Jesus came to earth and paid for my life, he saw something about me that was inherently valuable. You know, a creature who was created in the image of God and has an eternal soul and has capacity for tremendous things. So I have value. I can never look down on myself and think I'm worthless or valueless or hopeless or anything like that. It's not true. Jesus didn't look at me that way. So I'm not allowed to look at myself that way. And yet I'm not allowed to look at myself as though I'm better than everybody else out there, and therefore I deserve better than, that, to the point that I'm willing to mistreat others in the process. I should never be overestimating myself. Paul says in the New Testament, you should not think of yourselves more highly than you ought, but consider yourself like Christ, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself lowly and took the form of a servant. And so there's this balance of, I'm capable of great things, but I should accomplish those great things to the glory of the God who is greater than me, and do so by serving other people who in some ways have it rougher than me or lesser than me. So I don't know. It's a kind of a complicated concept here, but this kind of self-loathing that we see from Gideon, that we're just making excuses, those people don't accomplish anything, and it's not a godly attitude. It's not godly humility. It's just self-loathing. Devotional thought number 3: tearing down altars to create altars. This is a point that we've talked about idols. I know I talk about idols a lot, and so forth, but this is just such a very clear biblical example of how idolatry works practically in our lives. You'll notice that when the angel of the Lord has Gideon build an altar, he doesn't just build it in a vacuum. He doesn't build it out of nothing, but he actually uses his father's idols. And so he takes the Baal altar and he takes the Asherah pole and he cuts them down and breaks them down and uses the raw materials to fashion a new altar to the true God. I think that's really a beautiful picture, because what it means then is you can't actually worship the true God unless you tear down There's no such thing as having the true God be one God amongst many.
Mm-hmm.
To worship the true God, you have to tear down the other idols and altars to false gods in your lives. Whatever. And remember, the idol is the thing in our life that takes precedence, the thing that we think gives us meaning, purpose, identity, hope, and security for the future. You have to some extent, sacrifice those things at the altar of the true God.
My Bible says, if you are letting a desire for recognition, power, the love of money rule your life, you may find yourself besieged by certain enemies: stress, anxiety, illness, and fatigue. Keep God at the center of your life and you'll have the power to fight these destroyers. But when I read that statement, I was like, oh, are those clear indicators that I have idolatry in my life if I'm stressed, anxious, sick, or tired? Because I'm all those things.
Well, I mean, it's also, we all do have idols that we struggle with. Mm-hmm. So I think the idea that disproportionate loves or hyper desires in your life can wear you out and deplete you, as opposed to worship of the true God, which energizes you. I think there is a truth to that, mm-hmm. that false gods essentially want to take from you, and the true mm-hmm. God, even though they look like they're giving to you, and the true God, even though your flesh thinks he's taking from you, the reality is he's ultimately giving to you. Mm-hmm. And so if you find yourself constantly anxious, constantly spent, constantly angry, mm-hmm. constantly bitter, you probably are serving your false gods. Your anger is it's a force.
Symptom? Oh.
It's a force by which you're trying to protect something in your life. Mm. And oftentimes that's our ego or whatever. If we're anxious, we're trying to protect something. And it's like, okay, Jesus is our ultimate thing. If we're anxious, we already know that he's risen, so he doesn't need protecting. So why are we so anxious? It means mm-hmm. that we're putting something else in the throne position.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts for Judges chapter 6 and Gideon?
I don't think so. We'll hear more about him or no?
Yeah, we got a couple more chapters of Gideon, including kind of a famous battle scene with the Midianites.
That's what I was going to ask you, the Midianites. That's where... Did Moses' wife come from there?
I'm trying to remember now if Zipporah was...
Yeah, she was a Midianite, right?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yes. I'm sorry, yes. Across the Sinai Peninsula... So the Midianites, so far as we can tell, were on the far eastern side of the Sinai Peninsula.
And the dad was the priest, right?
Jethro, yeah.
And then he became an Israelite? A believer in the one true God.
Jethro? You're talking about?
Remember it said his family went...
Yeah. And traveled with Moses, yes.
With the Israelites.
Yes.
So he must have left his own people, and the Midianites went on.
You're correct. The extended family didn't all convert. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, which is what we're running into here. You also start to get part of the reason why there might have been some reluctance to drive some of these people groups out.
Sure.
Because there were potentially some pre-existing family ties that it's like, wait a second, we know those guys. They're our cousin's cousin kind of thing. And, so there's additional reason. There's all sorts of selfish and relational reasons why they didn't fully want to drive the Canaanite peoples out. Mm-hmm. So, shall I close the prayer? All right. Heavenly Father, we are more quick to offer excuses like Gideon than we are to jump forth and say, here I am, Lord, send me. We have all sorts of rational explanations for why we can't do the things that you've clearly set before us in life, whether that's sharing the gospel with friends and family, or whether that is helping out those who are in need, or in any way, shape, or form where you're asking us to prioritize you first and others ahead of self. We have all sorts of explanations and cultural reasons why we don't want to do that. But Lord, the answers are clear. We see how foolish Gideon actually is. We also see how patient you are with him and how much you accomplish through him. So Lord, forgive us for our stubbornness, our weakness, and our faithlessness. Give us courageous hearts that actually want to do your will, and forgive us for the times where we have been weak. May you still accomplish great things through us to your glory. In your name we pray. Amen. Thanks again for studying with us. We will see you tomorrow for Judges chapter 7.